Hi, everyone, and welcome to the live Zoom launch of Pablo Boczkowski's new book, Abundance, on the Experience of Living in a World of Information Plenty. My name is Carrie Rentschler, and I'm a professor of media studies at McGill University here in Montreal. My colleagues and I at McGill have had a long relationship with the Blue Metropolis Festival, especially around the Journalism in Peril events that Blue Met has hosted for many years. It's a real honor to be here today at the festival, and especially on this occasion with the launch of Pablo's book. We're going to have some time in this launch to take some questions from the audience. You can post those below under the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll check in on those as the hour unfolds, and we'll allow some time to turn to those. I'm going to introduce Pablo and then Dr. Ingrid Bejerman, who's going to talk with Pablo about his new book. Ingrid is Associate Director of Spanish and Portuguese Language Programming at the festival, and we want to thank her so much for organizing this event and many other parts of the festival as well. We're holding this launch virtually in Montreal and on Zoom, and as we know, and Pablo's book illustrates, what we call the virtual is quite real and quite locatable as a place. It shapes how we interact as social beings. People do great harm to each other on these platforms, but we also use them to ideally lead to more understanding, but also help us, hopefully, become more accountable to each other. And to that end, I just want to acknowledge the land I'm on and the land on which Zoom is located. This acknowledgement is adapted from some work my colleagues did to write an acknowledgement over at the Feminist Media Studio at Concordia University. While Zoom is the technical custodian of the platform on which we gather today, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we are all physically located. I'm speaking to you from unceded territory of Choctaw, now known as Montreal. The Konyak-Kanhaga Nation are the traditional custodians of these lands and waters. Although learning the history of where you are is an ongoing process, a really good starting place is the website native-land.ca. That actually is a project that is worldwide as well. And so I really encourage folks, if you haven't done this yet, haven't sort of looked up that important information and started to acknowledge that, that's a great place to start. The platform on which you gather today is provided by Zoom, a publicly traded company that's valued at $117 billion as of the end of 2020. Zoom's headquarters are located in Mi'kmaq Aulan territory. And when it comes to sustainability, communal living, and giving gifts to passersby, the Aulan have more to offer than just another corporation. The Aulan's horizontal society might inspire different emergent models of peer-to-peer connection in the pandemic. And as we meet today, let's just reflect on the unfinished work of restitution, justice, and reparations. Territorial recognition is necessary, but as we know, it's also inadequate, particularly if it's not joined to a demand for restitution and reparation. So I take that with me as I come into this conversation and afterwards as well. I'm so thrilled to introduce Pablo to you. Pablo is one of the central writers and thinkers in the field of media and technology studies. He teaches at Northwestern University, which is in Evanston, Illinois, where he's the Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani Professor of Communication Studies. A community builder and leader, Pablo founded and directs the Center for Latinx Digital Media at Northwestern, and he also co-founded and co-directs the Center for the Study of Media and Society in Argentina in conjunction with the Universidad of San Andres in Buenos Aires. He's authored 5 books, including Digitizing the News and News at Work, and edited or co-edited another 4, including the great collections, Remaking the News, and another on media technologies and the materiality. He's also got 2 more books coming out this year as well. One is The Digital Environment, which he's also co-written, I believe. And the other is The Journalism Manifesto, which I'm especially excited about and can't wait to read as well. Across all of his work, he thinks about the role that technology plays in social life, taking seriously the materiality of those technologies and the meanings and practices people develop in relationship to them. His books are gifts that readers get to think with. They are invitations to reflect upon the relationships between culture, technology, and social life in more thoughtful and even reparative ways, right? So it really matters what people do with technology, because that actually tells us about some of the ways in which people are relating to one another, and in many cases, caring for one another. His new book is a shining example of the reparative ways we can shift the focus on current conditions of information overload to examine their abundance in curating and cultivating social life, also in ways we know are not always nurturing or anti-oppressive, right? Abundance, the book, focuses on information abundance in Argentina, and specifically the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. Now, in our field, so much work in and about the global north really uncritically treats places like the US and Canada as if they are both anywhere and everywhere. Like, they tend to be quite universalizing. Pablo's book really decenters that in a fantastic way. It offers a major statement on information abundance from this particular locale of Buenos Aires, building theory from a key location, a major urban center in the global south, to reconceptualize our understandings of what others tend to call information glut, which often draws on a deficit model for thinking about information as its negative social impacts. And one of the things Pablo's book does is both recognizes that, but kind of shifts attention away from what is a more dominant way of thinking about information abundance. The book centers how Argentinians experience information abundance in relationship to their personal devices and screen technologies, breathing in the digital oxygen of online information and the social networks in which people encounter it, as Pablo put it in his TEDx talk, which I encourage everyone to see if you haven't. Online is where many of us live, a great part of our lives. And we hear that from the participants in the research that Pablo and his collaborators did for the work, right? One of the things they do, among many other things, is describe how platforms like WhatsApp are actually like going to a coffee shop for those intimate yet pseudo-public conversations that are so central to daily living. And the coffee shop holds a really particular significance in Argentina, as it does to ideas of the public sphere and the historical role that literary reading and conversation had to the very meaning of publicness, and really still does. Today, a lot of that public sphere is happening online, and it's also ideally happening in Zoom launches like this one. Across 158 interviews and over 500 surveys, the book tells a deep story of the social life of information in the city and the ways in which people navigate and manage it. To wrap up, I just want to say something that's slightly more personal about Pablo and about who he is. And he and his co-author C.W. Anderson said in their book, Remaking the News, that the goal of scholarly inquiry is not only to create and extend knowledge, but it also builds community through conversation. It's no surprise then that Pablo is a great conversationalist, which is something you are all about to witness. He embodies the very ethos of sociability that he tells us too is so common among residents of Buenos Aires and former ones as well, like himself. Montrealers recognize that ethos as something that also permeates this place and its embrace of the public life of reading, conversation, and just hanging out. And so that's how I want to sort of open up our invitation to Pablo to tell us more about his book. So let's get to some more conversation on that. And I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid Bejerman to do that work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carrie querida. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of Abundance on the Experience of Living in a World of Information Plenty, just out with Oxford University Press. I would like to invite the audience to start thinking about questions that already must be sparking in your head after listening to Carrie's wonderful introduction. It's always my pleasure to connect the cities of Montreal and Buenos Aires. I think I was pretty much put on this planet to do that. So thank you, Pablo, for this opportunity again, and welcome. It's a pleasure and a real honor to have you here today. So let me start with my signature Blumet question. I am in charge, as Carrie mentioned, of the programming in Spanish and Portuguese. Sorry, which, in this signature question, unsurprisingly has to do with language. And it's obviously very fitting for this book, the writing in terms of the writing and the content. which draws on a bicultural experience. So Pablo, please start by telling us about your own relationship with the English language and with the Spanish language too, but elaborating on how it informs your writing and scholarship and also your life. So tell us about English and writing in English and whatever you'd like to share with us.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, Ingrid, for the invitation and for making it all happen, and Carrie for this amazing introduction. I hope I can live up to the portrait that you have presented, and to everybody who's in the audience for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. I'm sure there are many greater things to do than this, being in front of a screen. So I'm very, my heart is warm by all your presence. So yeah, I for the most part these days I write in English. English evidently is not my first language. I was born and raised in Argentina, and I actually learned English when I was 27. So I learned a little bit in high school. Essentially, I learned to cheat to get a good grade. That was as much as I learned. But I had taken a couple of years of English in elementary school in a private institute and learned almost nothing, or at least retained almost nothing. But when I was 26 or 27, I decided that I wanted to do postgraduate education in the States. And I decided to get English language lessons. So I did well enough to pass the English exam, the TOEFL, and to do decently in the GRE, so that I was admitted to graduate school in the US. But I would say that for the first few years of graduate school, it was, you know, my command of English was fairly limited, to the point that I had to write with a dictionary. I had to read and write with a dictionary next to me. I had to watch television with closed captioning, etc. Fast forwarding to this day, I have become now much more comfortable writing in English, and it's my default language for writing. I would say probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to do more media writing in Spanish for different venues. And there was a relearning process in the Spanish side for me. Now I am comfortable writing directly in Spanish, but yes, English is, it's a wonderful acquired language for me. And I dream in English too, which is interesting. I mean, the dreams, I'm sure I dream many more things, but the dreams that I remember very often are in English. So I have become sort of used to that, in particular for work stuff. For personal stuff, I mean, I talk more in Spanish, etc. But yeah, that's my relationship. I feel very blessed that that I've been able to learn another language and to work somewhat fluently in it. And it is slightly, as you mentioned, Ingrid, the bicultural aspect. It is a slightly, how could I say, unsettling experience to be writing a book about Argentina in English, right? And to find the words to convey the texture, right, of everyday experience in a language that is different from the language in which that experience happens. And it has been an interesting journey in that sense.
Thank you, Pablo. That's a very Blumet answer, by the way. I mean, it's one of the questions that we tackle constantly, the art of translation, the science of translation, and the whole idea of rewriting another, because it's literally the act of rewriting another world or another reality. The work of the translator is very complex and very interesting. So now I'm going to jump around a little bit in topics. I'm going to touch on many things because we don't have that much time. So to make sure that we cover quite a bit of things. So I'm going to go now to your previous books that your prolific production, as Carrie mentioned. Dr. Rentschler was in my doctoral committee, and she's familiar with all this literature much more than, I mean, you know, than I could, she examined me in it, let's just say. And Pablo wrote a lot of the, or co-authored or put together a lot of the work that I had to look at to become a doctor. So one of them is this book, Remaking the News, that Carrie mentioned. Well, actually, this wasn't in my PhD, but the work of Chris Anderson was. And this book I actually used in my theory classes. And this one was very popular in 2018, also in my critical approaches to journalism class as well. So Pablo, one of the things that you do in your literature that you show up all the time, as Carrie was mentioning, in the building of community and in the whole creation of anthologies or working together, because that's something that academics do much more than non-academics, the work of collaboration, the peer work and all of that. So tell us about, and again, this is an inside joke between Pablo and I, because he's the opening act of my headliner today, or he's the opener, which by the way, it got for technical difficulties, we're gonna be doing this tomorrow, Caetano Veloso tomorrow at 7 p.m. Monday. But since Pablo was opening for Caetano, anyway, Pablo, this is your solo album, Abundance. You know, you're not playing with your band. So tell us about your solo performance, the experience of doing it different. And if not, I mean, even though you're the solo writer of the book, who are your collaborators and who are the people that helped you in this journey? There's quite a few names that you mentioned in your acknowledgements, and who are the people that are with you in this journey?
So, so there are lots of people who helped me out directly in different capacities. So the interviews and all the data from this book was collected within the context of the Center for the Study of Media and Society in Argentina that my collaborator and dear friend, Eugenia Michelstein, and I run together. And then the interviews were conducted by a number of research assistants. They are coordinated by Mora Matassi, who also did some of the interviews, but she oversaw all of that work. That it was 158 interviews over 21 months. It's a long period of time. Mora is now a doctoral student at Northwestern, and she was absolutely instrumental in making that happen. There were lots of people who read different versions of different chapters. There were a few people who read the entire thing. Eugenia, Mora, Celeste Wagner, who's a student at the University of Pennsylvania, also Argentine, who also was part of the center, and Amy Ross Arguedas, who was a student here at Northwestern, now is at Oxford. And they helped a lot. Amy, in addition to that, Amy was a reporter at La Nación in Costa Rica. Is a fabulous editor. So she went through all of the translations of the interviews and the matching, because all the people whose stories I share have been anonymized to protect their privacy. So the 158 people is a lot of people, and you tend to make lots of mistakes attributing quotations. So she did essentially quality control. She went through all the quotes and a long spreadsheet with all the different identifying and de-identifying information. So the de-identifying information, not the identifying, the pseudonyms, etc., and made sure that everybody who was attributed to the quote was the right person. That was a painstaking job. Amy was absolutely incredible at doing that. And then I have many friends, including Chris Anderson, who you mentioned, but many others. I don't want to single out. There are lots of people involved by one, because otherwise I'm going to forget people and they would be rightly upset. But it is true that I am the only one whose name appears on the cover. But this is impossible as a journey. It was almost 5 years of work. From start to the very last version. It would have been impossible without the collaboration and the participation of many of everybody who I mentioned and many other people. I wrote articles together with them. I thought together with them, and they blessed me with their ideas and their time and their feedback. It is a different enterprise than an edited volume. The craft of putting together an edited volume is being self-effacing. Essentially, I mean, you do the intro, you might write a chapter, but you are assembling a group of people to have a public conversation, essentially, and you do your best to have each one of their parts shine. But you have to self-efface yourself in order to do that. I've done enough of these volumes to have that sense. This is a different story. It's a little bit my baby, but I'm not the only one who participated by no means.
Thank you, Pablo. Speaking of your baby, the whole point is show us the baby, because we want to see
sure.
it. Yes. Because we don't, oh, very nice. Very nice.
Sporting the colors of the Argentine flag. Thankfully to the designers of Oxford University Press, they asked me if I had any recommendations. I'm not very visually gifted, but given the topic of the book, I asked if they could take into account the colors of the Argentine flag, and they did an incredible job, in my opinion.
And who chose the font also? I mean, if you could show it a little closer, it's really, it's a, yeah. And the choice of the font, was that yours or was it from the
No, all theirs.
Very nice. It's kind of evocative of typewriters also in the I mean, a little of the digital.
Right.
It's really nice.
Right.
Well, congratulations. There's a baby, and as you were saying, also it does take a village to raise the baby and to bring it together. Now, Pablo, speaking of the birth of the baby, let's go back now. Let's take us back to that evening in late June of 2018, which is in right in the middle of the Argentinian winter, or the Buenos Aires winter. As you're walking down Avenida Corrientes, the book opens with that thought, and you've recently produced an op-ed for Infobae about this, starting with from this point of departure. And you're walking down Avenida Corrientes toward Plaza de Mayo in the heart of the city of Buenos Aires. And then the idea came to you. Tell us how it happened. Now we want to hear it in your words. You write in the book. And
Sure. So yes, I had just arrived that day to Buenos Aires. I was with my oldest daughter, Sofia, who I believe is, on the Zoom. We were walking down Corrientes Avenue. I had just picked her up from one of her grandmothers. She was spending some time as I was doing an interview at the radio. And then we were going to the other grandmother, so my mother. It was dark, it was maybe 8 p.m. Drizzling, if I remember correctly, although I'm not sure. And as we were walking by, we passed by the building where my late father used to have his office. And then a little bit, a few steps after that, but more like a block after that, the Centro Cultural Ricardo Rojas, which is an extension arm of the public National University of Buenos Aires. And so it's very, very, very familiar territory for me. I had been there many times. And then I see two people ostensibly living on the streets, very young people who, had all their possessions tucked away. They were sitting on a couple of sort of worn out chairs. They had their possessions tucked away between their backs or their chairs and the building. And what caught my attention was that, they were having dinner. They had a can of Coke on the right side. They had a plastic container with food. And they were sitting down next to each other, holding a phone. One of them was holding a phone. And they were watching it as you might be watching television as you're having dinner. So I was stunned by the image to the extent that in order to make sure that I remembered it correctly, I grabbed my cell phone. I took a picture at a distance. My older daughter got very shy and went into a candy store as I was doing that. Even it was only 30 seconds. It wasn't a picture I was going to use for anything but to remind myself of the details. And what struck me was the contrast between the extreme material scarcity and the abundance of information that even in that context they could access through a smartphone, probably connected through Wi-Fi, so some publicly available Wi-Fi, etc. I'm assuming they were not paying, given that they were ostensibly living on the street, but I don't know, never got to talk to them. I mean, something sparked in me. It was also the very, very familiar territory, a scene that you see everywhere in major metropolis in Latin America and other parts of the world, unfortunately, because of rising income inequality. But it was the novel twist of the smartphone, right? The typical quintessential, family having dinner in front of a TV, but instead of that, instead of a living room, middle class, etc., which is how we imagine that scene, context of poverty, of material poverty and information abundance, so to speak. So that stuck with me, and sort of as the writing, the analysis and the writing unfolded, became sort of a focal point that organized many ideas that I was having as I was doing the analysis of the data. I did not know that it was going to play that role. It certainly grabbed my attention, and that's how the book opens. And it's a very sad state of affairs. It's even worse now than when it was when I did the research. In Argentina, at the time I did the research, about 1 in 3, essentially, 30 or 33% of the population live below the level of poverty. Now it's 40%, including 54% of children in Argentina live below the level of poverty. And the level of poverty is, you know, I can't remember exact figures, but you need to make very few dollars in order to be above the level of poverty. And even with that extreme poverty, there is access to the smartphone and usually connection to WhatsApp at the minimum. So yeah, it's that's how the book opens, and that because in part it's how the story opened for me.
Thank you, Pablo. But let me just say, you know, as you mentioned, that this is a reality of every major Latin American city, but it wasn't the case in the Buenos Aires that you grew up with, right? I mean, do you see the contrast, or do you think that it's sort of idealized? Because I'm saying I traveled again also between a lot of my hometown Campinas and Buenos Aires a lot, and it was night and day in the 80s. The poverty was in Brazil, but not so visible in Buenos Aires, you know, not even close to this as what it is right now. Maybe, again, memory is warped a little bit, but it was nowhere near at this level, right?
It has certainly worsened, but there was a lot of poverty, not at the levels that there was, you know, 5 years ago or even now. Yeah, so there is, I mean, Argentina had within the Latin American context a more historically a bit more robust middle class. But by the time I was growing up, that was eroding, and certainly took a terrible downturn during the military dictatorship that ruled the country between 76 and 83, in addition to crimes against humanity, et cetera, et cetera. They really decimated the economy.
Thank you, Pablo. Let's stick with the terms now. So then Global South, again, in my own lifetime, it's been developing world, then, I mean, third world, then developing world, then like low income middle countries, or whatever term in the English language to designate down there, you know, Global South. How do you feel about your country being designated with that term, and what's your reaction? How do you feel about that? The Argentina of Jorge Luis Borges being also Global South, how do you negotiate that own, you know, like within, as someone from Argentina and the US, I mean, what does that mean to you, Pablo?
So the Argentina is designated as the Global South is not the Argentina of Borges. So we might want to keep that in mind, because the country has changed a lot, and Borges had a particular standing in society in terms of, you know, social class, status, etc. So it is a complicated term. Look, I'm really not a perfectionist in this sense. I mean, it is like any other term. It is problematic because it's grouping together lots of things that only share one characteristic, but do not share many others. But as Carrie said in her wonderful introduction, a lot of the conversation tends to take what happens in a handful of countries that occupy only 14% of the world population to represent what happens in the other 86% of the world's population. So Global South is the term of art now to designate the importance of looking outside that 14%, right? And to understand that those conditions are the minority conditions, and they are the privileged conditions. So I use it because it does the trick to do that, but it has many other limitations, and I'm fully aware of that. Because I'm not too much of a perfectionist, it doesn't bother me that much because it helps me get that message across, but I'm aware that it's limited, like all of the other terms that you mentioned, right? That are limited. You know, middle-income countries, low-income countries, a little bit more precise, but it's very sort of, it has the jargon of economics, think tanks, policymakers, which is not the angle of the book.
And also the other terms are obsolete, like the third world would be when there was a second world in communism. You know, it's yeah, it's just that I find in general, because the earth is round, however, it's always designated as something that isn't in the north, or that's, I mean, within the dichotomies, you know, but we'll return to that. I will also I want to actually focus a little bit on what academics refer to as terminology, but we at a literary festival simply refer to as the word. So in fact, yours is the only event that doesn't feature the word palabra, or in Spanish, or palabra palavra in Portuguese of today, mind you, as I mentioned, the one that was happening today is now postponed to tomorrow. But my previous talk that just happened with Javier Cercas, it was called Palabras que profundizan el pasado, from where we're coming from. And then our final one with Caetano Veloso and Alexandra Lucas Coelho, which again, I repeat, is tomorrow, Monday at 7 p.m. En otras palabras, meaning in other words in Portuguese. So the words in the title of your book are really evocative. There's like abundance, experience, you know, and of course the title of this talk, which is A World of Information Plenty. They're very evocative. They're very poetic in terms of the title, not like academic, sure, but also very evocative. You know, they make you imagine or think about lots of things. So let's start first with abundance, which you make a point to differ and to defer. I'm always nodding to Jacques Derrida here, but you make a point to differ abundance from information overload. So what does that distinction between abundance and information overload mean to you and to the book? What is that distinction? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of the kitchen of the book, the behind the scenes, it's my first book in which the title appeared to me before writing any single word. And it did not change. It was very interesting. I had the title before having a single sentence on the book. The idea of abundance is the idea, it's just simply that, as my buddy Fred Turner put it when he read an earlier version of the first chapter, he said, there is just a lot of stuff. There is so much information, right? There is so much, right? And I just wanted to convey that we have now taken for granted that, for instance, we can be having this event on the screen, right? Which would have been unthinkable when I was growing up. And I'm not that old, and I'm not 500 years old. So it would be absolutely unthinkable to think that. And the word abundance is a little bit, has less of a negative connotation, or as I say in the book, a discourse of deficit associated with it, as the term of art, which is information overload, or as Carrie said, infoglut, which is what my colleague and friend Mark Andrzejewicz uses in his book, and what other people have used before. And the reason why I wanted to move away from that is because a lot of the conversation about having a lot of information tends to focus on the negative side. But there are many positives about it. Simply put, I mean, about 43% of the population in the planet are on social media, on at least one platform. That's more than 4 every 5 people. If we include the people who have access only, right, because there are lots of people in this planet who don't have the means, either the connectivity or the access to the hardware, that is more than 50% for sure. So nobody's forced to be on social media. So there has to be something positive. Otherwise, people would not be so much. And then they spend an enormous amount of time. We spend an enormous amount of time on social media. That's, I mean, for starters. And then when you think about some of the most important, in my opinion, and it's my politics, but some of, and people are free to have other opinions about this, but in terms of my politics, when we think about some of the most important social movements that have really put us forward in emancipatory goals over the past 5 to 10 years, these are all social movements that have taken advantage of this abundance of information, the platforms, the smartphones, etc., to organize and to get their message across to the population. I'm thinking, for instance, Ni Una Menos in Argentina, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, etc. It is not the only reason why they have been successful, but without these tools, they wouldn't have been successful, at least in the same way that they have been. It is possible to say. So I simply wanted to move away from the unilateral discourse that associates these technologies and having so much of it with negative outcomes. There are plenty of negative outcomes, but there are also plenty of positive outcomes. And I wanted to do that. In the end, the book is a very humanistic book, and it's a little bit anachronistic in that sense. We live in an era in which we are somewhat sort of fascinated with the newest and greatest, AI algorithms, etc., book after book, documentary after documentary. They tend to come with apocalyptic tone associated with that and a fairly dystopic scenario. But in the end, we still have us and our agency and our role to play in making things happen. And I wanted to tell a story that was profoundly humane, that you know, put what I believe is the center of all, which is human agency, even in the making of these technologies. And therefore, it's a story that interrogates us and compels us not to, you know, move the responsibility to others, not to blame outside that, but to regain responsibility in the society that we live in, which is society that we make every day, in the good and in the bad.
Perfect. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you so much. Let's continue on that note. Actually, continuing with words and definitions. In the meantime, I'd like to remind the audience to keep thinking of your questions in English and Spanish for the end, as they pop up, to write them down and things, so you can type them up and we'll get to them at the end of this talk. So we'll continue with words and definitions. So as we mentioned earlier, and I'm going to get a little academic, the book takes a sort of bicultural approach. And as we know from Raymond Williams, the word culture is one of the most complicated words in the English language. So I want you to share with us, please, and with the audience, your own working definition of culture, the scholars working in this area that inspire and influence you. You draw on the work of James Carrie at one point, and you come up with your ritual view of information abundance. You know, tell us a little bit what Pablo's definition of culture is. How do you define it, and what is culture for you and for the book, and what bicultural means, like as open-ended as you like.
No, I understand. It's a great question, but I'm not sure I am up to task to define that. What I would say in terms of my own intellectual biographies, when I was 19 years old, in my first year of undergraduate, I took an introduction to sociology, and we read Berger and Lachmann's The Social Construction of Reality. And I believe I have never left it. It is by far the most influential book for me, you know, 35, 36 years after that. And it is all over the intellectual architecture for this book. Because when I mean by culture in this book in particular has to do with meaning and routines, which is at the core of the Berger and Lachmann, and then Schutz, you know, phenomenology, et cetera, I came before. Now, I should not take credit for the use of Jim Carrey's notion of the ritual view of communication in this book. It was not part of the initial version that was sent to the publisher. One anonymous and exceedingly insightful reviewer suggested that I use it to, you know, encompass different, you know, arguments that I was making. I don't know who this person is, but I would thank, because it's an anonymous process, I want to thank wholeheartedly. It does take a village, and that was an incredibly influential review, not for Oxford University Press. The book was reviewed for 3 publishers, and I had to make a choice. And in the end, I went with Oxford, but I took advice from all the reviewers that generously donated their time and ideas. And in that sense, again, the book is very anachronistic, because I go back to Jim Carrey. We are obsessed with, you know, big data, counting, computational social science, etc. And abundance is an Argentine tale. You know, it does, through the tale, it does, the story tries to make a conceptual contribution, hopefully it does, but it is through the story. And Jim Carrey's work in terms of, you know, communication as culture, coming together, meaning, etc., was a wonderful way for me to make the overall argument, but I will not attempt to give my own definition. I just borrowed and you know, cited the people who have influenced me, but yes.
Well, that actually answered my question. That was my question. You know, what is your operative definition, drawing on the scholars that inspire you? And of course, Berger and Lachmann is a fantastic text, was also, I mean, very influential, I think, to all of us. So thank you, that answered it perfectly. And continuing also, because I mentioned Raymond Williams on this Marxist approach to culture, and now I'm thinking also of the work of Stuart Hall that immediately comes to mind. If you could please comment on one of your findings regarding the consumption of news, where socioeconomic status continues to be more determinant than age. You know, like that, if you could please comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, so what I find, one of the things for the people who have not, in the audience who have not read the book, the book draws, among other sources, on a survey of 700 people in Buenos Aires and the suburbs, which include about 40% of the country's population. Due to lack of funding, we could not do it in the entire country. And among other things, we look in the survey at structural determinants of how people use platforms, personal screens, news and entertainment. And in the case of news, unsurprisingly, socioeconomic status is the main driver of how people inform themselves. And that is different from the consumption of entertainment or how they use platforms or how they use personal screens. And it has to do with the fact that in Argentina, much like in the States and almost every other country that I know of, television is still the main source of information. We are enamored with everything digital, but it's still a television show. And it will continue to be for quite some time, because the difference in terms of the percentage of people who say that TV is their main source of information versus the percentage of people who say that social media or news sites are the main source of information is staggering. Right? It's like having Barcelona play against, my team, San Lorenzo. So they will win 6-0 or 7-0. So TV is still by far the dominant medium, and it correlates, it tracks with social class, with socioeconomic status. And in a country like Argentina, with a very large portion of population either below the level of poverty or barely making it, it comes as no surprise that that is the case. And it also has to do with other things that we know in the field about the role of socioeconomic status in interest about information, interest in politics, etc., etc. One of the wonderful things, Michael Shatson said that in his blurb, and he also commented, that of doing research is that that's where you find how things are. Again, if you read most of the commentary about information, news, etc., it's all about digital. But in reality, the action is not really there for the most part. It's still in the world of television and radio to a significant extent. So that's about that. Ingrid, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it very much answers the question. And yes, it does answer the question. I also, again, want to invite the readers to go and buy it. They can find it at global.oup.com, right, at the Oxford University Press website to find out more about the actual study and the findings, especially. So now, because we don't have that much time, there's two questions that I do want to ask. I hope I can get to both, that have to do with writers and your relationship with writers. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned also as well that at the beginning of the book and also in that op-ed that you took a course with Ricardo Piglia about Borges that changed your life. I'd like you to comment a little bit on two things, on what is it that changed your life about it or your perspective, and also how you situate yourself as an Argentine writer in the diaspora, given especially in the university milieu, because I can think of so many like Piglia, who was at Princeton, or Tomás Eloy Martínez that was at Rutgers, but also the non-academics like Ariana Harwicz in Paris or Samantha Schweblin in Berlin. It's such a thing of the Argentine writer abroad outside of Buenos Aires. You think of Julio Cortázar in Paris, going back. So how do you situate yourself as a writer in terms of this, a writer in the diaspora outside of Argentina? And tell us about the course with Piglia and what you learned.
Okay, so let me flip the order. I became Argentine when I moved out of Argentina. I am and will always be Argentine, but it became a very important part of who I am once I moved out. When I was at Cornell doing my PhD, I never took a class with him, but he advised me and read some of my early work, and I had a few conversations with Ben Anderson, the late political scientist. So Ben had it's a wonderful article in 1994 in Critical Inquiry called Exodus, that the article starts, essentially the argument that he makes is that you become more, of your sense of national identity increases remarkably when you are outside of your homeland. And in particular, if you stay outside of your homeland. So Abundance is a tribute to my homeland, homeland that doesn't exist anymore. Argentina exists and will always exist, but so I'm paying tribute in part to my memories and to the mix of the Buenos Aires that is today and the Buenos Aires that there was before. And that course with Piglia is a perfect example for people in the audience who might not know who Piglia was. Carlos Perea is a spectacular fiction writer and also essayist. And he taught at Princeton in the Department of Spanish for many years. And when I was probably 23, 24, I was already working in the hospital, I remember. So it was after my BA. I took a class in an extension course, essentially, at the National University of Buenos Aires. Imagine somebody's a future Princeton professor teaching people for free at night how one might interpret or read Borges, right? I mean, that only happens in a place, not only, but it's typical Buenos Aires, right? So I wouldn't say it changed my life, but it really dramatically changed how I read. I mean, the thing that I remember even to this day is that I had never encountered somebody so brilliant and who could extract so much meaning out of a text. I was literally blown away, literally blown away. I mean, I had been a Borges devotee since I was a teenager, but I had just read Borges. I mean, what did I know? And there was somebody who was able to tell stories about the stories and to analyze a text and to relate it to other texts. I was mesmerized. I never knew that one could read like that. And I had taken, when I was 19, in my last year of high school, I had taken a very small seminar with David Viñas, also another very illustrious Argentine novelist and literary critic. But it was Viñas, talking about the social and political history of Argentina through fiction. So it's a different spin, and I didn't have that much connection with the material. But in this case, Piglia really, I mean, seeing that somebody would have that erudition, I mean, it made you enjoy the text in such a different way. So that has really, really stuck with me. When I'm not a great reader of fiction, I don't spend a lot of my time reading fiction, I spend a lot of time reading nonfiction, and I try in part to do that with the texts that I read to the extent that I can, which it never will be anywhere close to the caliber that Piglia had.
I bet it also inspires your teaching as well, right? You know what it's like to take a good class, and that's so inspiring, or that you want that your students to come away also with that effect, feeling as mesmerized, as you feel, right? It's
yes, with my limitations, somebody like Piglia.
Yeah, actually, I want to remind again the audience to keep thinking of questions. So one more question, actually, it's more of an anecdote that I'd like you to recount for us that you've told me once about, well, your early days, your beginnings as a digital journalist yourself, because you wear many hats as well. You have like an ethnography, like you do ethnography. You also, you're a bit of a historian as well, because again, as a communication scholar, you're a journalist, Tell us about your early days as a digital reporter, and also about, and I'll just mention Adolfo Bioy Casares, to mention a big names in Argentina.
So again, for people in there, Adolfo Bioy Casares was an Argentine writer, not a literary critic, just fiction writer. He didn't do any poetry, right? It was all prose, right, Ingrid? Or did he?
Yes. No, I think so. I think it was. I mean, one never knows, but I think. I mean, but I think it was prose. Yeah.
Okay, so the
because I always end up discovering that even Michael Ondaatje has poetry, like it's but yes, that I know of, yeah.
So Bioy Casares, his most important work is The Invention of Morel, La Invención de Morel. When I was 15 years old, I was in high school and we were doing a year on contemporary Argentine literature. The teacher asked us to divide us in group and task us with interviewing an Argentine writer who was alive. We wanted to do Borges, but another group, called the name first. So we went for Bioy Casares. Believe it or not, so I picked up the phone book. I opened the phone book, looked Bioy Casares, and I called him up. The other team did the same with Borges. And we, my teammates and I ended up spending at the tender age of 15, 2 hours with one of the greatest, fiction writers in Spanish in the 20th century in his living room, just chatting about his experience. He was a dear friend of Borges, and they wrote together a few books under the name of Bustos Domecq, right? I think that's their joint pseudonym. so that was a very interesting experience. I had never met anybody like him. And then exactly 15 years later, when I was in my first year of PhD at Cornell University in centrally isolated Ithaca, upstate New York, which has nothing to do, it's about 30,000 people, nothing to do with the 3 million that lived in Buenos Aires at the time. My favorite hometown newspaper, Diario Clarín, went online in 1996. At the end of March of that year. And to celebrate the launch of the digital edition, they decided to do a series of chats with important personalities of Argentine culture. The first one was Bioy Casares. The invention of Morel is not only a very it's a masterpiece, I think, in terms of fiction, but it's also credited with being the first sort of literary manifestation of virtual reality. I encourage everybody in the audience who hasn't read it to do so. So the people at Clarín thought it was fitting that they would have a conversation with him. So I joined. I remember it was a Friday evening. I was in downtown Ithaca, joining on internet relay chat on a 28.8 modem on a very, very, very clunky computer. And what was interesting was that it was the public asking the writer the questions, as opposed to the journalist asking the writer the questions, right? So that sort of caught my attention. 2 days later on Sunday, to promote the launch of the website, the newspaper ran a 2-page spread on its Sunday edition. At the time, they had more than 1 million readers for the Sunday. It was the largest Spanish-speaking newspaper in the world at the time. And they tell a story of the behind the scenes of what happened. And what I saw was, and they did have a few pictures, it was Bioy Casares in the same living room that I had been, on the same dining table that he had gathered with us, surrounded by, I would say, 10 to 12 people who are making it happen technologically, right? So Bioy did not know even how to type, okay? He dictated his novels. So we learned that he was very nervous, and he used to like, I remember, white wine. So he had a couple of drinks to loosen up. And, you know, he would speak the answers. He would read the questions from the audience, speak the answer to a microphone, and somebody would type. And at one point, you know, somebody tripped over the plug, so they had to reconnect. And there were all kinds of things that we know, right, are the stuff that makes media and technology happen. So that's the start of my research journey. I remember I see, because I can see the participant list, I see that my dear, dear friend and incredible mentor, Trevor Pinch, is attending this, and Trevor was my advisor. I remember I went to Trevor's office a few months later and said, I have a great dissertation topic. And I told him the story, and we talked about online newspapers, and that was the beginning of it for me. So even though I'm not a very devoted reader of fiction, fiction has been a major, I mean, the literary world, in particular, the Latin American fiction, has been a major source of inspiration for me, and turning points in my career related to this directly, which is why it's an incredible honor to be, you know, launching the book in the context of a literary festival. When I got the invitation, I was over the moon to do this. And this book, you know, begins with Gabriel Garcia Marquez and ends with Borges. And it's my most literary sort of book so far, even though it is an ethnography and it tells the stories that the way we ethnographers tell the stories. It is infused with the literary work, because part of the message of abundance, if there is one thing that I would sort of like to convey, is the sense of awe. It is incredible that we live in the world that we live in. It is the world that literary writers could dream of, but ethnographers would have never been able to encounter. So I want, in a context in some, you know, in which digital technologies have been associated with all kinds of dystopic scenarios, I want to pause for a moment and recover the sense of wonder, the sense of surprise, and to convey the message that it's on us what we do with these technologies. It is not written in stone. Algorithms are not magic. It's stuff that we make and we remake as we use, and that we have the power to turn things around and to make this a better world, even though we don't have the market capitalization of Google or Amazon or anything like that. I mean, it is still possible to turn things around towards more emancipatory ends and to build a more just and fair society.
Well, I would like to end as for myself on that note, but of course the audience, I really los invito también a que hagan sus preguntas en español y que Pablo también las pueda contestar en español. Así que adelante con las preguntas. Voy a poner aquí en el chat. A ver. Aquí. Okay, I'm going to read a question for Pablo from Yiping Chia. What would be your advice for teaching abundance to undergraduates? What could be the most important takeaway for aspiring journalists or communication professionals from this book?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. So my main advice is to never forget the power of storytelling. I mean, in the age of the algorithm and AI, storytelling is timeless. And the book is written in a little bit of an old-fashioned way, really showcasing the lived experience of people, using theory to make sense in a very sort of surgical way of critical terms and to explain some key questions. But it is through the stories of the people. And if you were kind enough to teach this book, and I would greatly appreciate that, I would say foreground those stories and teach through those stories, and let me know how it went.
Thank you, Pablo. So now a question from Nathan Walter. Thank you, Carrie, Ingrid, and Pablo. What is the relationship between the abundance of information in quotes and its value? Is the value of information diminishes? Oh, sorry, I think that's a typo. As the value of information diminishes, as it becomes more abundant and easier to access, as the law of supply and demand would predict?
That's a great question, Nathan. So I would say it depends. So another message of the book is that it is context dependent. I mean, it depends is a little bit of a bad resource that we social scientists tend to use. But I do think a lot of what happens with information has to do with the context. How is it used, by whom, to which ends? Right? So in some cases, the more of something, the less the value it has, like inventory in digital advertising, for instance. In other cases, the more of something, the more value it has. So if there are many more people joining a social movement and trading messages, then every contribution increases the value for everybody else. So in the book, I used the idea of emergent valuation, the notion that things are not always bad once we have a lot of it. Whether it's bad or good depends on the context and the meaning that emerges from that context.
Thank you, Pablo. One more question here. Sorry, it's just it's a bizarre experience for me as a moderator to have gay talk men sitting on the
hey, hi,
objectivity as a professional ritual is one of my key texts. It's just bizarre. But anyway, it's like my library is sitting here, So an anonymous person is asking, what was the most challenging part of making and writing this book?
So of the writing process, it was how to convey the sense of awe and wonder, right? How to make something that we live with every day. We use platforms every day. My phone is a part of my body. When I say every day and all the time, in America, people are on media 10 hours and 26 minutes every day, according to one statistics. If we think that people sleep on average 8 hours, out of the 16 hours that they are awake, more than half of the time they are connected with media. And we just take that for granted. So the main challenge in the writing process was how to make what we take for granted into something that gives us a sense of surprise and curiosity, and that, shows puzzles that we need to try to answer, or questions or puzzles to solve, questions to answer, etc. I would say that was, from a writing standpoint, That was the main challenge. And my main inspiration to try to tackle that challenge was the Nobel lecture, the acceptance speech that Gabriel Garcia Marquez gave when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1982. In which he basically says, I mean, it's my interpretation, of course, but and I will never do it justice, but that magical realism for those of us who are from Latin America is just to tell the story of what we see. That the reality is so incredibly rich that all we need to do is to tell the story. We are not inventing anything. And so I took inspiration from that to try to tell the story of abundance in that way.
I think it's safe to say it's a very accurate reading. So Sophie has a question. What was your favorite part about writing the book?
Sophie's my daughter, one of the two of them. Sophie knows, because the book is dedicated to both of them, that my favorite part, and so does her sister Emma, both know that my favorite part, it was the many conversations that I had with both of them about how they were using these tools and how they are friends. It was typical that their friends would come over and I would pester them with questions. Show me Snapchat. How do you do? Why do you do this? Because for me, it's like, an acquired taste, but for them, it's really second nature. So the book was in part a way for me to try to make sense of their world, right, from a vantage point of my world. And in essence, the book is very adolescent in that sense, right? Because I try to be fascinated with the world in which I'm inhabiting. When you are a kid, when you are a child, you are fascinated with the world, but you don't feel that you can make something in it, in the sense. When you are a teen, it's the first time in your life in which you experience that sense of agency and ownership, right? So writing a book in a conversation with two teens, trying to understand their world and enter that and make sense of it from a very different, positionality and, in everything that you can imagine almost, grew up in a different part of the world, in a different century, etc., etc., etc. That was my favorite part, that process of exploration and the many conversations. Sophie also gave tremendous advice on the preface and the ending of the book. So I'm very grateful for that as well. This is the first book in which I had feedback at home as well.
This is my question, are any of your daughters following in your scholarly footsteps, you think?
I don't know, I have to ask them.
Okay. We'll ask them then another time. So then Pablo Escandón, when is the Spanish edition, or any plans for Spanish edition?
I would love for the book to come out in Spanish sooner rather than later. Hopefully there will be interest among editors. I do have the rights in Spanish, so that should make it a little bit more accessible. Hopefully soon. It's not up to me, but hopefully soon.
Perfect. Thank you, Pablo. If anyone else has any other questions, I think, again, I invite you to buy the book and that we can continue this conversation. And Pablo, one last question from my end. When is the next book coming out? If we are to have I'm always thinking of the next festival.
So as Carrie alluded, this year, this is the first of 3 books that will be published. The Digital Environment, which Eugenia Michelstein and I wrote together, is coming out with MIT Press in August. And the Journalism Manifesto, which Barbie Zelliser, Chris Anderson, and I wrote jointly, is coming out in October in the UK and in December in the US. Okay, wow, it's quite a prolific production. Well, we hope, we can do an event. Especially now that we have these platforms and now that we're actually so connected. This is a welcome to Montreal, or way to give you a welcome to Montreal. It's a pleasure to have you here at Bloomette. Carrie, thank you so much for the beautiful, beautiful introduction and welcoming Pablo. Thank you so much. And I invite everyone to continue enjoying the festival. Well, this would have been our last event. Pablo's still the opening act for Caetano Veloso, but I invite you to join us on Monday, tomorrow at 7 p.m. on YouTube and Facebook, BlueMetropolis.org. And wish everyone buenas noches. Have a great evening, and I'll see you very soon. Thank you, and
and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ingrid. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, members of the audience. Bye now.